Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, on this very special day. It is July 1st, the day of Keti Koti, and on behalf of the Clue Plus Research Institute, I would like to welcome you to the webinar series, Black Lives, Past and Present. My name is Aaron Petera, and as a FU alumnus, I'm honored to be a moderator today. And I'm also looking forward to showing you some of the work I do with students in film workshops dealing with monuments and memorialization. I work for the Educational Projects Department of the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. I develop, manage, and implement projects combating anti-Semitism, discrimination, and racism that enable youth to make their voices heard in traveling exhibitions and in film workshops. In recent weeks, we have been reawakened by loud voices of anger and sorrow at the injustice called racism. They speak of violence that kills people. They also speak of hidden power structures in our society that put people at a disadvantage because of fewer opportunities to develop themselves or because of ethnic profiling. The Research Institute Clue Plus of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam wishes to take part in the courageous conversations about uncomfortable questions with sometimes painful answers. By organizing a series of webinars on the history of slavery, colonialism, institutional racism, and violence, we hope to contribute to these conversations with insights from history. Remembering the history of slavery and race relations in Europe on the day of Keti Koti is the title of our first presentation. And it is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our main presenter today, Dienke Hondius. Dienke Hondius is an assistant professor of history at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and staff member of the Anne Frank House. Currently, she is the Ida E. King Distinguished Scholar of Holocaust Studies at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey. Among her research projects are mapping slavery and mapping hiding places. Among her books are Blackness in Western Europe, and she is also co-author of the Amsterdam Slavery Heritage Guide, Dutch New York Histories, and the Netherlands Slavery History Guide. For questions throughout the webinar, but also during the presentation, please forward them to us by using the Zoom Q&A function. To begin with, I would like to show you a film clip in which students take a closer look at the National Slavery Monument in Oosterpark in Amsterdam.
First impression is something like struggle, because you see a group of people chained to each other, and a lady falling down. But what struggle? It's a mystery to me.
Maybe some kind of god or king, or who was like watching over these people, and then being like a prophet. That's sort of what I see now.
Once they walked through the gate, they were free to do whatever they wanted. Maybe going to a free world, hopefully.
I think it has to do something with the Second World War.
Het gaat over de slavernij, anders de afgelopen slavernij. En het is een herdenkingsmonument van hoe het was. En ja, dat we ons toch kunnen herinneren om zo'n fout nogmaals niet meer te maken in de toekomst. Daar is het voor. En het is ook een vreugdemonument om te herinneren dat we bevrijd zijn. En dat we van onze vrijheid moeten genieten. Achteraan gaan de mensen gebukt onder het leven en dan gaan ze door de poort van bevrijding en dan komen ze reizend er weer uit. En dat is toch heel duidelijk vormgegeven.
In 1998, an Afro-European women's movement submitted a petition to the Dutch cabinet, which brought up the discussion over building a national monument to commemorate the history of slavery. It took some years, but on the 1st of July 2002, the national monument by Erwin de Vries was unveiled in Oosterpark in Amsterdam. Every year in July, a celebration called Keti Koti takes place at the monument to commemorate this period of history. There have also been protests because of speeches by politicians.
And there's one thing I know nothing about. I did not know they had slavery here. I know they're very hard workers, but slavery I didn't know. Africa's the only place in America they had slavery. I don't remember anything about it here in Holland. Because once a year we celebrate the freedom here. So we cross this monument maybe 2 times a day. And while she's at the age now that I can explain it to her. And so I just did.
And I think a lot of people are recognizing that it's not only a glorious history we share, but we have a lot of things we should be very ashamed of that we did as a nation in the past. And I think people are starting to realize that and wanting to do something about that. And especially now there's a lot of discrimination in Holland. So it's a very actual theme, but I think it's changing. Yeah.
I think that's a hard topic here in the Netherlands because I think the Dutch people think they celebrate it, but they don't because you don't get a day off or something. It's something that they're like, oh yeah, it's been such a long time ago, and it was not me, it was, I don't know, it was people before them. So it's something that they really, yeah, they try to, I don't know how you say it. They act like it's nothing and it already happened, so get over it. And it's something you just don't get over that quickly. So, yeah, but they try. They're trying.
Er zijn struggelingen. Het gaat toch moeizaam, maar het gaat wel beter als voorheen. Maar dat heeft ook te maken met dat er meer immigranten en donkere mensen zijn in het land zijn komen wonen. En dan zie je toch dat men beter naar elkaar gaat luisteren en bereid is ook om toch dingen te erkennen en toe te geven, omdat het toch heel belangrijk is voor beide partijen.
Okay, thank you very much for watching. This actual video clip was produced in a 4-day film workshop called Memory Walk, where young people learn how to research monuments, learn how to research in archives. They learn how to conduct street interviews. They learn how to edit. They learn how to put together those pieces to finally create a video dealing with one of these monuments. I will just have a look if we already have some questions. No questions yet. Dinka, did you start your screen share?
Yes, I have. Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Aaron, for showing this film clip on a very special day today, the 1st of July in Keti Koti. For those of you who can look at television in the Netherlands, there was a live stream of the commemoration at Oosterpark, at this particular monument that we've just seen. And it was quite impressive because of Corona, we can only see it on television, just like we are now not able to be together for this seminar, but it's a webinar. Everything is only online. But I hope that you will be able to see later some of the talks and some of the songs and the poems that were expressed on this very special day. the commemoration of Keti Koti and of the abolition of slavery in the Netherlands started in 2002, and it was long overdue. And you now see the interviews that Aaron's students made in front of the monument show that some people have no idea where they are, and other people know a lot about it. And to have a space, to have a monument, a permanent place of commemoration has been quite important. So it is now in 2020 that with the Black Lives Matter movement and the new anti-racism movement generations that we see that actual places of commemoration are so important. And when you are in Amsterdam, you visit Oosterpark, you often see people talking at the monument. It works as a monument, I think. My talk this afternoon is about the deeper trends in race relations, and especially the deeper trends in racism in Western Europe. And I would like to start with showing you the other monuments that we have right now, because we're going back in time. I want to take you back in time in 5 centuries and look at where are we now, and how can we go back in time, which important moments can we distinguish in this long history. So today there are 4 important monuments. There are 2 in Amsterdam. You see on the right and on the right hand side downstairs the 2 Amsterdam monuments of recognition and of liberation. And on the left you see 2 monuments in Rotterdam, one of where the enslaved and the freed enslaved are dancing, and the one in Middelburg in the southwest of the country, which was an important slave trading port and maritime area, is a sober monument connecting peoples. That's the idea, but also showing the blood that was shed. So these are very modern, new monuments, but that is very recent, because it took a very long time for the Dutch to recognize this. Later we will show you what happened in 1963, because there was a little bit of commemoration taking place in the Netherlands before, so in the 20th century. But it was organized by the Afro-Surinamese community. They had very strong feeling of commemoration and of celebrating the emancipation of slavery, and they began to organize that also in the Netherlands. And we have found a film clip that we can show at the end of this webinar. But apart from that, it was very, very silent. Not just in the Netherlands, we see that all over Europe, that slavery was not remembered, abolition of slavery was not celebrated. There was a kind of deep silence about this whole history. So I want to take you very quickly back into many different centuries. When we look at the 20th century, it's important to recognize that these were, first of all, the years of the formal independence of the Dutch colonies. In 1975, Suriname became independent. In 1954, the Netherlands Antillean Islands were in a new combination with the Dutch kingdom. And in 1945, Indonesia became independent. And when we go back more into the beginning of the 20th century, we see that there were anti-colonial movements already beginning. At the same time, when we saw fascism and National Socialism in power, there were always voices against that. So the 20th century is a century of persecution, of racial thinking and of empire, but also of decolonization. So it's a very complex century. And it is also the century, we situate that around 1920, I will show you some pictures later, when anti-fascism and anti-racism became new concepts. So we don't see that before the early 20th century, the idea that racism and anti-racism are a concept. Then when we go back in time to the 19th century, the 19th century has important moments in 1873, when the former enslaved were finally liberated, did not have to work on the plantations anymore. 1863 is an important moment for the formal abolition of slavery, but we go all the way back to the French Revolution, which was also the revolution in Haiti, and it's a long century in which slowly but steadily slave trading and slavery are being prohibited. The first revolt and abolition took place in Haiti and in the French Empire. The second took place in the British Empire, and the Dutch, like the Americans, were very late and came to abolishment of slavery only in 1873 with the end of the apprenticeship system. Now, financial compensation for slave owners was something that happened also in the 19th century. And it is important to realize that both the British, the Dutch, and the French compensated slave owners. So slave owners were lobbying for financial compensation, and they were successful in that. And it has taken a long time, but that is now being studied in many different universities. And so it's important to know that happened, and that of course the enslaved were never compensated. They got nothing, but the slave owners received money for that. And we have.
Can I ask you a quick question? We have one question that came in. Could you please give your opinion about the reason why? What started this thrive for compensation?
That's a very good question. Why did they cry for compensation? Well, the slave owners regarded the enslaved as their property. It was their money. It was their property. So they regarded it as a loss that slavery was now threatened with abolition. So as a result, they demanded compensation, and they organized a lobby. They were lobbying the government, the local government, and those lobbies were successful, both in Britain, in France, and in the Netherlands. And we also know that in parts of the US, I think in Washington, D.C., there was also compensation. But we're looking at it at the moment. So they basically came up for their property, and as a result, the slave owners had to come forward. They had to prove that the enslaved on the plantations that they owned were still alive. And if they could show that, then they were given financial compensation.
Thank you.
When we go back to the early 19th century, we see that the slave trade was prohibited. And that is also a very important moment, because it took a long time. In 1807, the slave trade was first prohibited in Britain, and in 1814 it was prohibited in the Netherlands. But it was never sanctioned. There was no punishment. So in actual fact, slave trading continued after that. So it was an important moment. It didn't make much of this difference until 1825, when there were some sanctions. Then when we go to the next period, we have the long period of the 18th century, the 17th century, and before. And that is where we see that slave trading and slavery continued for more than 2 centuries. So slave trading was active for 218 years, and slavery for 267 years. It was tolerated and legalized, but it was also questioned and fought against. So slave trading and slavery were never completely unchallenged. There were always some counter voices and counter actions. I personally take 1596 as a starting year for the Netherlands because of the history of a ship that was filled with 100 black men, women, and children that came here in the town of Middelburg, most likely to be sold off. But for Western Europe as a whole, we can better go back earlier to the early 15th century, when in 1444, the first ship with enslaved Africans came into Portugal, in the small town of Lagos in Portugal. At that time, the Pope and the local authorities gave their blessing to conquest and enslavement. So this is the way we can go back in time. In my talk, I want to explain, next to these long periods over 4 centuries, there are 5 patterns that I've addressed of race relations in Western Europe. And the most important one that I see is the pattern of paternalism. Now, paternalism is not hatred. It's not racial hatred. It's not anti-black hatred. Paternalism is a condescending attitude where, as a white person, I say, well, I know things better. I know what's good for you. So it is the attitude of a parent to a child. And it is from the side of the paternalist, from the side of the fatherly or motherly figure, always well-intentioned. I know what's good for you. I will explain you once again how things are being done, but it is a very particular power relation. Yeah. You want to ask a question? I thought I heard something. No? Is Aaron? Is there? Continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. Good. So, as you can see here, those 5 main patterns are, first of all, racial paternalism, and anti-black racism and white supremacy are part and parcel of that. That is one combination. The second is infantilization. It is how white Europeans look at Africans and Asians as children, as permanent children, as somebody that they have an immediate and natural power over. So the idea is that white Europeans are unable or find it very difficult to live and work and deal with African and Asian people as adults, as grown-up men and women. There is the tendency to belittle someone, to regard someone as a child is very strong. And in the book, I show examples of that throughout the centuries. It is very much connected also with Christianity. Romantic racialism and exoticism is the next trend, and that is again a sort of well-intentioned idea that African people and also Asian people are extra beautiful and extra exotic and extra sensual or sensitive, a kind of romantic idea. And this is a trend that we see particularly in Europe, maybe in Europe more than in the US, and also in different ways, and it is also very much unchallenged. You see it in poetry, in paintings, and also in how people write and have imagery about Black people. So that is also, and it is hard to tackle because it is that always has that positive connotation around it. The next one is favoritism. That is the idea that when a white family has a white enslaved servant, it is a favorite, it is an exception. Sometimes a few Black people will get access to Western Europe. There's general exclusion, so there is a kind of, the idea of fortress Europe has remained intact over 4 centuries. It is never the idea that complete African or Asian or mixed families can settle in Europe. They have to remain away, but there's an exceptional entrance is allowed to favorites and to some people who get this as a kind of gift. And that creates small Afro-European and Afro and Asian European communities throughout the centuries. And the next part of the next trend that is very strong is that of dehumanization. The idea that the African and Asian is not really a human being, but is an animal or a thing. And we see that during the slave trade and slavery, there's a formal dehumanization where the enslaved, we find them in the records, then they are recorded and counted as things, as species, as numbers. So that this the word there is thingification, and they may also be described as beasts. So there are different kinds of animals. So this animalization has two different parts. You can have beasts of like cattle or that you tame and who work for you. That is often how the enslaved are described. But when they are revolting, when they are coming to resistance, the image is quickly that of beasts, of dangerous animals and of predators. So those two images are also quite important. Now, yes.
We have two questions. One, I think, with a rather short answer. Would you say that white saviorism is some sort of paternalism?
Yes, a good point. White saviorism has often this connotation of I, as a white person, and then as a white expert, will explain you how things are, and I will help you do your struggle and save your life. Yes, that is, it is, and with white saviorism, you can see that this attitude did not stop with the abolition of slavery. It continued into the 20th and 21st century. So there's something to be aware of. Yeah.
Okay. And the next question, could you further explain the connection to Christianity and the concept of infantilization?
Yes, well, the idea of Protestant Christianity particularly, but Roman Catholic also, is that all people are children of God. So we are all in a way, and that God is our Father. So the fatherly image of God and the childlike image of the believers is very common for Christians. So that is also used as a kind of excuse or as a kind of justification for slavery. Slavery and the slave trade were justified, and there was a struggle to justify it. It was never completely unquestioned. From the early 16th and 15th century onward, it had to be justified. And then the idea of a fatherly God who takes care of all his children was helpful in sustaining that image of the permanent child. And then it is also preferred image of the slave owner that he will say, and you see that right up until the 19th century, I, as a slave owner, have all my children with me, my own white children, and my enslaved who are also kind of children of me. So it is a preferred image of the white slave owner that he sees his family as mixed and everyone together under his leadership. And when that is challenged, when that sort of benevolent idea of a fatherly slave owner is challenged, then immediately you get the harder image of the dehumanizing image of you're a dangerous animal and I have to tame you and have to punish you. So that is where the whip comes in. So this, you have to realize that it is a preferred self-image of white Europeans to see themselves as these fatherly figures. And they get away with that unless it is challenged. Okay. Now, throughout this whole period of slavery and slave trade, keeping distance was important, and that is the difference between slavery in the United States and slavery in Europe. Because the European slave owners lived mostly in Europe, and they were keeping enslaved an ocean away. So they would not allow the enslaved to come to Europe or to live here. Whereas in the United States, slavery was around the corner. It was everywhere, very clear, nearby. And to keep that distance intact, the enslaved, but also mixed families, were always forbidden. They were prohibited to settle permanently in Europe. And we see the repetition of prohibitions of settlement in the Netherlands, but also in Britain and in France. Not complete prohibition, so there were always these exceptions who were allowed entrance as a kind of gift, but the general rule was in Europe we make decisions, and overseas, over the oceans, things can be different. So there slave trading and slavery was allowed and continued for such a long time. And that explains also why, as a whole, Europe has remained so white. That is not a coincidence, but it is the result of a very long history of exclusion and formal exclusion and prohibition of settlement in Europe. Now, these trends continue also after emancipation. So we see that there is no significant mass migration of Africans and Asians or Americans after emancipation. So it is very much a question what emancipation really meant at the end of the 19th century. So I'm studying that now with my students. What did emancipation really mean in Suriname? What did it mean in the Dutch East Indies? What was continued, and how did these inequalities continue? We see that a lot of imagery, the idea of these patterns remains intact, and that they continue until today. And as a whole, I would say it is an understudied and also unrecognized history. So it's important to continue with that. The next slide is to show you some monuments that are an expression of that paternalism, and these are monuments in Washington and in Boston. So the one on the left is from Washington DC, close to the White House, and the one in Boston is upstairs, and they are now completely controversial, these monuments. What you see is that, and is President Lincoln who strokes an enslaved man or freedman. It's the Freedman Memorial, and this image shows paternalism, I think, as clear as you can get it. And it is not a coincidence that these monuments are now very, very controversial, and that the Black Lives Matter movement is protesting against it and says, well, it has to go. We've had these monuments for a too long time. Interesting is that these monuments were paid for by the former enslaved, by the recently freed enslaved in the United States. So they were the ones who paid for these monuments, and with the few dollars that they were paid, they together paid for this monument. So the idea is that gratitude was important, is shown in this monument, and it reminds me of a monument that we have here in Amsterdam. It is not a monument about slavery and the slave trade. This is a monument. Monument van erkentelijkheid, so monument of gratitude in the Weesperstraat, in the city center, and that was made by Amsterdam Jews, paid for by Amsterdam Jews right after the Holocaust, right after the Second World War. You know that more than 75% of the Amsterdam Jews were killed, were in the concentration camps, and the few that returned, not many people were helped. So it is. This is also a monument paid for by surviving Jews out of gratitude, and it is also a monument that the Jewish community now does not want to have anymore. So we feel these were monuments of gratitude. Now they are monuments of shame. We feel shameful when we look at these monuments, and we think it is time for these monuments to go, or to tell a story about what happened at the time. So it's an interesting comparison, I think. Now, at the same time that these monuments were built in Washington and in Boston, the slave trade, which was was already forbidden, was still continuing. So we see now here the first, and until so far I know, some of the very, very few photographs of enslaved children in the 1860s on the East African coast. So the reality of slavery was very much there when these monuments of gratitude were already built. This is another picture of enslaved children aboard a ship, and I think they are very, very impressive. With a picture, with a photograph like that, slavery comes closer to us than on the drawings and paintings that we have. So the late 19th century photography was just invented, and there was a photographer on a British Navy ship that took these pictures. I show a few pictures also going back in time. These are nephews. We know them from Arthur Japin's book about the Two Hearts of Quasi-Boachi. It's an exoticized portrait of the two nephews who came to live in the Netherlands because their father and uncle was active in the slave trade with the Dutch. And as a kind of gift, they were given permission to travel to the Netherlands and study here. But you see here that they are first portrayed as a kind of romantic portrait. This is another portrait of the same two young men. They were drawn by racial scientists, because these racial scientists in the 19th century were interested in their skulls and also in their hands. And it is from an article by a racial scientist from Leiden University who then made a drawing of them. So the very few black people who came in the 19th century to Europe were exoticized on the one hand, and they became objects of racial science, or what was called racial science, on the other hand. The few Africans and Asians that were coming, or sometimes were invited or brought to Europe, were also exhibited as objects. This is the history of the world shows. In many different European cities, you have these exhibitions, world exhibitions, where Black and Asian people were exhibited, and it continued until the 20th century even. We know examples of Belgium, for example. And now we go to the 18th century, and here you see a romantic portrait of what I guess must have been a favorite servant of a wealthy Amsterdam family. We don't know his name yet, but it is a beautiful portrait. And on the other hand, you see these anonymous portraits. So in general, we know still very little about the Black people in paintings. I will show you just a few. Of this woman, we know the name. She was baptized in the city of Delft in 1794. And that is how this drawing and a story of her baptism was kept. This is a family in the 17th century, painted by Frans Hals, with a black servant of whom we do not know the name. And this is by Diego Velázquez in Sevilla. Also, we don't know her name, but it is these paintings do bring people much closer to our houses and to our hearts, I think. So they have an interesting function. And it has taken a long time for art historians to study these paintings. This is an example from France. And this is a famous portrait by Rubens that can be seen in the city of Antwerp. And in Antwerp, we also know this very early portrait of a woman named Caterina. She was 20 years old, and she lived in the house of a Portuguese family that was a representative of the King of Portugal, living in Portugal. And Albrecht Dürer, the painter, painted this portrait out of gratitude to the Brandau family, who gave him a lodging when he visited Antwerp. So we now know that there was quite a black presence, early black presence in 16th century Europe and 17th century Europe. Not large groups, but small groups and individual people who lived in different cities. And Katerina is a beautiful example of that. As I said, that so now we are back in the 20th and 21st century, and we see that these patterns of paternalism, the patterns of exclusion, have not stopped but have continued into the 20th and the 21st century. So it is something that when we are more aware of these patterns, we can try to change them. That I think is the aim. When you recognize something, when you see a pattern, then you can try to make a resolution to do something about it. And one of the first anti-racists were Melville Herskovits and Francis Herskovits. They were anthropologists at Columbia University in New York City, and Zora Neale Hurston was one of their research assistants, and first she was a research assistant, and she became a famous African American writer. Herskovits and went on, did a lot of research studying the African heritage of African American people. Also went to Suriname. Wrote about the Maroon communities, and Zora Neale Hurston also did a lot of research together with Herskovits. And the group of these anthropologists in the 1920s and 30s began to think differently about Black people. They were looking at African ancestry, but also at anti-racism as a concept. Ruth Benedict was another part of this group, and it is in this group that we see a change from racial science, which was completely accepted in the 19th century, to anti-racist research and African heritage research in the later 20th century. And then the reason why they began to change that is that they were aware of what was happening in Europe with National Socialism. So it was the rise of National Socialism, of the Nazi Germany, that made these American anthropologists aware of the need to think of anti-racism as a movement and as a concept. So what we see is that times are changing. We're thinking differently about monuments. We're thinking of new monuments. We're thinking differently about pedestals. Who do we put on a pedestal and why? Who deserves a pedestal? A sokkel, as the Dutch and also the Germans call a pedestal. I think it is a fascinating discussion, and something that we will no doubt be talking more about. It is not easy to study these things and to talk about these things, because anti-Black racism and just like anti-Semitism is a very tough and very resistant form of hatred, I would say. So it can be presented as benevolent and well-meaning and well-intended, and it is very difficult to topple it. So the idea that we will ever get rid of anti-Black racism and ever get rid completely of anti-Semitism, I think we cannot expect that, but we can make steps in the right direction. And I think what we're seeing at the moment with these new generations of anti-racists moving together and in a very mixed movement, a multi-generational movement, is hopeful. And I want to end with a quote of the African-American writer James Baldwin, who says, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." So we have to, and I think that is what the anti-racist movement at the moment does really well, we have to include our bodies, we have to include the effects of visible difference, and we have to be aware of that. For a long time, both liberals and conservatives, but also the left, Marxist theorists have denied the impact of visible difference of skin color. It was denied, or you were better colorblind, or everything was economically explained. I think we have to realize that anti-black racism in itself, just colorism, just the skin, about shades of skin color, is a very tough and strong form of racism around the world that we have to recognize wherever we are and try to change. And that is what Baldwin says: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So that is what we are trying to do, I think. I have here some suggestions and new developments. I'm very happy with the new exhibit at the Rembrandt House at the moment. This is the catalog of that exhibition. You can also see it online. So for those of you who cannot come to Amsterdam, you can see that exhibition online. It is well worth seeing about Black communities in Amsterdam. And then, of course, we have our Mapping Slavery project, and we've published 3 different guides. And there's a lot happening in that field here. So those were my suggestions. Thank you. And here are the pictures of the books. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dinke, for your insights and sharing your research results with us. We do have some questions that came up. One of the questions is more about data, and maybe you have an idea of where people can find answers. Do you have data on the numbers of male-female enslaved people brought to the Netherlands and their origins over the centuries?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. Yes, I do not have the numbers right in my hand, because we are talking about enslaved from the East Indies and enslaved from the West Indies, from the transatlantic, because both forms of slave trading were very important, of course. It should be possible to look at that, and I'm also interested very much in the age of the enslaved. So I have been looking at that, and what I did see is that the number of enslaved children, the percentage of enslaved children, grew very much in the 19th century. So you see that in the 17th and 18th century, there were more young adults, the strong young adults who could work on the plantation. In the 19th century, more younger adults, so teenagers and children are enslaved, with the idea that they could work on the plantations longer. And also that it was easier, you could pack more on a ship and they would not revolt so easily. Men and women, I do not have an immediate answer to that. This too requires a lot of calculation.
Okay, then we have another question dealing with the numbers. About this one deals with the financial compensation of slave owners. Is there research, or has there been a tracking of owners and their families throughout modern history? Where's this wealth now? What has happened to it? Are these families still in other business? Is there still some sustainable wealth from this period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a very good question. What happened with the wealth of the slave owners? The first real research project about that was initiated in London, at University College London, and it's called Legacies of British Slave Ownership at University College London. And they have a fantastic website and a database based on 1833, when the slave owners received compensation. Who were these people who received that compensation? So you can look at thousands and thousands of names in that database, and they have also looked at what were their professions, what were the addresses, where did they live, but also the professions, their political position, their financial position, their economic position. So all those networks, and also cultural networks of the compensated slave owners are now mapped in that project. So they can show a lot of continuity into part of the political elite in Britain. I remember that David Cameron was easily traceable, but so the British researchers are a few steps ahead of us in that way. And here in the Netherlands, we have a database built at the National Archive by Okke ten Hove and Wim Hoogbergen. So it's called Emancipatie, Slavernij, Suriname en Nederlandse Antillen, 1863. So it's an index, and there you can also fill in your name or the name of a plantation, name of a city, and you can see how much these slave owners were paid out, and also where they lived, and some more information about that. We do not have a biographical database yet. I know that Okke ten Hove is working on that, and so the information is there, but we could still work much more on that. Yeah.
Okay.
In France, also there's also the French slave owners. Also very new research. It's only the first article has just been printed by a French researcher. About French compensation records. So we are finding out, and we don't know anything about Spain and Portugal yet. So it is ongoing research. So everyone come study history at our university and help us to do that research, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have one question we received, and it deals with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously lots of universities have, especially in the Netherlands and the VU, have quite high rankings. For instance, dealing with gender equality. I'm reading here 37th from 549 participants. But the question is that we got, why have universities and other institutions' commitments to diversity and inclusion failed, especially within the context of other successful commitments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the awareness at the university and the prioritizing at the university of racial diversity and ethnic diversity is very, very young. So there is now, you read it out, one of the statements of our university is young, and I've been teaching at an American university, and see all the universities are now making these declarations, but we will have to wait and see what comes of that, and if it will be effectuated. I think maybe in the next 5 or 10 years we'll see how real that is, because at the moment it is no, not a very impressive picture yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. We have another question about research that is already been published or maybe in the progress about Black identity consciousness and Black awareness of systematic anti-Black racism in high colonial times. Is there research out there?
It does not immediately spring to mind. Anti-Black racism is a term used by Arthur Kane. So he was a director of NINSE until a few years ago, and he has continued to write about that. And in the United Nations project of UN Decade of People of African Heritage, some new research is happening. But I'm very interested to hear more. So maybe people can leave those messages for us to have a look at them. That would be great.
Okay. Then we have one specific question about Curaçao. Is there a movement to include more of the colonial history or slavery in public education in the Netherlands? And I think there's also one example from the video clip that we saw when the lady says, well, I knew the Dutch were hardworking people, but I didn't think they had anything to do with slave trade or slavery. Mm-hmm. Is there, in public education, what do you think?
Public education, well, I would say there's a kind of struggle. There are people who write curriculums and study books who will say, well, we have written a few pages about that in our study guide, so that should be enough. So it's a little bit, reminds me of how first was written about the Second World War. If you mention something, it is already enough, or maybe it's already too much. On the other hand, there are a lot of people say, well, I've never heard about anything about this in school. So my generation, I was in school in Zeeland, and a very important part of the Netherlands in terms of engagement in the slave trade. I never heard anything about it in school. That is now changing. It is changing. And it is now part, so paying attention to the slave trade and slavery is part of the new curriculum for primary schools and for the first years of secondary schools. But of course it's up to the schools and up to the teachers how they will deal with that. And it will be very important to have more talks and more trainings, I think, with teachers in the Netherlands to see how they can connect them. With our project Mapping Slavery, we have an educational project, and we show people that all around you are traces of slavery history and of Black heritage. If you open your eyes to, not just in Amsterdam with all the canal houses and the buildings that remind us of that, but also in all the provinces of the Netherlands, and same is true for Britain and for France. If you know, if you trade, what does it say? Follow the money back into history, then you find a lot of connecting points for local history that you can use in education. So there's a lot possible. It is changing, but it is early days yet. There's much more that we could do.
Mm-hmm. One more question about additional literature. Could you recommend a book about the history of slavery in different American countries, ideally if it links to the present established system?
Yeah, for the American history, but that also in connection with Europe, I like David Bryan Davis, Inhuman Bondage. So that would be, if you have time for one book, that would be my suggestion. Inhuman Bondage by David Bryan Davis. And I'm also fond of the comparative history of racism. That's called Racism: A Short History. So there's less about slavery, more about racist societies and racist systems by George Frederickson. It's a short book, Princeton University Press, but very interesting and very meaningful.
One more question, well, and it also relates to what I sometimes feel. It's I don't want Black Lives Matter to remain a mere hashtag. There's this, energy around now that you feel that there might be a change, but we have one question: how can we ensure that this momentum is not lost?
Yeah, well, that is a great question for everyone who's watching and everyone who's engaged in this. Yeah, I think it is important to be hopeful and to try to do something where you are. I was inspired by Aminata Cairo. She was a speaker at a demonstration in the Nelson Mandela Park, and she said everyone can do something. You don't have to be an important leader, or you don't have to have decades of experience in anti-racist movement in order to do something. No, everyone, if you've just become interested and engaged in this in the last 5 minutes, there is something you can do. And it is important that you try out something. So it's all about making steps in the right direction, and that you will feel that sometimes you do not. There will be uneasiness. You may disagree with parts of the movement. You may feel awkward in some company. That is inevitable. The idea is that of a movement is that you can move together in the same direction. but you have to find your spot, find your own spot where you feel that, oh, here I can do something, here I can get along here a little bit. That's how I like a big stream where we all are moving in the same direction, and look at the longer term goals. So there will be setbacks, there will be reactions also, there will be difficulties and conflicts in working together, but then also look at the longer term, and in the long term, I think progress is happening, and there's a place for everybody in this movement.
Okay, let's take one more question. I would like to apologize to everybody whose question we don't answer, but it's great to see so much interest. To what extent is there an active and widely used anti-racism vocabulary prominent in mainstream Dutch media, films, television, etc.?
Well, the vocabulary is always changing, and the fact that we are now beginning, or that the idea that you should not use the N-word is also becoming more known and debated in the Netherlands, and also in Poland, I heard, for instance. So we've seen the same with names for migrant workers or foreigners, or it means that language is sensitive and that it is a reflection of sensitivities in society. So language is alive and changing, and there is a very helpful book written by, last year or 2 years ago by the Wayne Modest and a team from the Tropenmuseum. It's called Words Matter. So that is a free book. You can download it and everyone can use that. Woorden doen ertoe. So words matter, and a very concrete which words are now old-fashioned and what are alternatives that you can use. So it would be very practical and no debate there. But without the idea that we have the final say about a certain word, because those words that we now think are okay will become sensitive again, and we will discard them and replace them by other words, because that's the nature of language.
Okay, well, Dinke, thank you very, very much in taking time to answering all these questions. And again, apologies to all the attendees who had questions and have not received answers yet. I think you put up your email address before, Dinke, so if there are questions concerning your research, everybody can feel free to email Dinke. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending this first webinar. This was only the first of a series of 3 webinars. I would like to remind you about the second webinar on Wednesday, July 8th from 4 to 5. Our speaker will be Wim Manuhutu, and the title of the next webinar is From Main Target to Golden Child and Beyond, Decolonizing the History of the Moluccas. And I would like to end this webinar with one more video from 1963. It shows the 100-year celebration of abolishing slavery. These shots are from Suriname. So thank you very much for your time and for attending this webinar.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you for attending, everyone.
Gisteren is een feest gevierd in Suriname. En alle bevolkingsgroepen hebben meegedaan. De Hindoestanen en de Nederlanders. De Javanen en Kriolen. De Bosnegers, Chinezen en Indianen. 1 juli is niet meer alleen een feestdag van een enkele raciale groep. De verre afstammelingen van de slaven. De emancipatiedag van de Kriolen is omgedoopt tot een dag der vrijheden voor alle Surinamers. Want als bewoners van 1 land hebben zij allen te maken met de mijlpaal in de historische ontwikkeling, het feit van de afschaffing van de slavernij. Er is uitbundig feest gevierd. En voor 1 dag zijn alle problemen vergeten. En er zijn vele problemen in een land dat zich midden in zijn sociale en economische ontwikkeling bevindt.